So, as we start to think about our instruction sets, it's important to really start at the beginning to start to analyze who's our audience. And this is the first thing that we want to do before we start thinking about anything else. Who is our intended audience? And then, based upon that, we need to start asking some specific questions to help us craft our portfolio. We've talked before in chapter 5 about audience, and oftentimes we'd like to say everyone is our audience. That's simply not true. You have a very specific audience based upon what your instruction set is, based upon what tools that you are asking them to use. There are certain groups of people that will not have some tools. And you have to think about then maybe what gender, what economic class, what age bracket, what skill set do they have or not have, right? And so based upon that, we can start and analyze who our audience is and what information they need. From there, what needs to be defined to them? What needs to be described to them? And what is better shown with images versus expressed with writing? And so we're going to talk about some of these a little more in depth, but these are some things that you should really start to consider. So for example, we're going to look at two different types of mac and cheese recipes. So this is the recipe for Kraft mac and cheese. Who's Kraft mac and cheese's audience? Typically, if we think about it, they run about under $1 for a box. So we could talk about potentially college kids, maybe those on a lower economic bracket, maybe even folks with lower or limited reading skills, right? We can also tell this because of how their instructions are. I don't even have to be able to read it. I can see 8 and then I see the water coming out of the faucet. So, okay, I need 8 probably cups of water. A half of a cup of that margarine, right? Just by looking at the images, we know what's there. So we have these clear, large images, very limited text. We have after school kids coming home and having to make mac and cheese for dinner, right? So we have someone who's probably at a 3rd grade reading level who can do this, as well as maybe a college student who's had a very late evening, right? And maybe some lower cognitive function at the time, right? In order to make something. So this is reaching some very specific audiences for some specific reasons. Now we're going to look at an allrecipes.com recipe. This is also a mac and cheese recipe. So those who are going to allrecipes.com are going there for a specific reason. They want to cook a meal from scratch. They're not looking for boxed ingredients. Oftentimes there are people who enjoy cooking, who are writing about cooking, who are collaboratively adding their information about how they made a meal better, so you kind of have a tried and true. We have way more text, very little image here. Again, we have chunked out information with ingredients on top, directions on bottom, serving information. We have ratings, right? Very different, both mac and cheese, right? But very different audiences. We have some of the same ingredients, but we have some additional ingredients here too. So if we're looking at our different audience needs, we can start to think about words versus images. So let's say we have an older population who did not grow up with technology, right? Or computers, let's say. Because let's not forget our pencils are also technology, but I digress. So we're looking at computers. Maybe we're trying to teach grandma or great-grandma how to use a computer. Well, if you were to just say, okay, we'll go grab the mouse and right-click, grandma or great-grandma probably doesn't know what the mouse is, right? So what are you referring to? And how do we describe that to them? So how would you define what a mouse is, right? And then how will you prompt them to do that? You'll probably have to take a screenshot, right? You'll have to include an image. You might even need a little glossary section of what the terms are with images and what they mean, right? We don't want grandma to think about the rodent in the corner who's eating cheese, right? At some point that might seem a little silly, but we think it's silly because we are so comfortable with the technology and we know it so well, right? So trying to think about that. Now, if we were writing this, let's say for high schoolers, we probably wouldn't have to let them know what a mouse is, right? Or we might not have to even describe how to right-click something. We should also describe something. So what is it that we're going to be describing? And how do we do so to an audience that might have no knowledge of this? Like, how do you describe how a pineapple tastes, right? To someone who has never had a pineapple. How do you describe what something should look like if we're not putting an image in there, right? I mean, what are our descriptor words, right? How can we build that image in their mind's eye? All right. So thinking about some of this, these are kind of some prompting jump off questions for you to start thinking about. Work with your partners to start an audience analysis, to figure out what your project is, what is going to need to be defined and or described, and how you might do that. This is a really good time as you're starting to storyboard that to include those elements within your storyboard. You're probably going to have to modify this list as it goes on, but it's really important to start thinking about it from the get-go. All right, as always, if you have any questions, let me know.